Hello, everyone. So can you hear me in the audience and in the Zoom? Welcome, everybody, to this second day of this EXALT methodological workshop. So yesterday we heard a keynote by Chappie Wilson and comments by Sarah Green and David Evan. And then today we will continue with 4 more speakers and then commentaries. And the topic here is what kind of methodological approaches there has been in the study of extractivisms and alternatives. And we have first as a speaker Anja Nygren, professor of, I will present first everybody, like the professor of global development studies, and she will be talking about ethnography and archival research and in the study of, for example, especially political ecology. And after that, we will have Sergio Sauer, professor of from the National University of Brasilia. And he has studied, for example, agrarian extractivism and alternatives in Brazil, and will be talking about what methods he has used. And then I will talk about, my name is Markus Kröger from Global Development Studies. I will be talking about how to use qualitative comparative analysis in the study of resistance to extractivism in India and Brazil, for example. And then lastly, we have Ksenija Hanaček from the Autonomous University of Barcelona and from here in Helsinki, and she will be talking more about statistical and large data methods for studying a global setting of extractivist conflicts. And after that, we will have comments by Chappie Wilson, and everybody else can join and comment and ask questions. So the idea of this workshop is also to look at the different onto-epistemic epistemic approaches and premises of research, different kind of methods, to have more like a debate about the complementarities, differences, and so on, because there has not been so much detailed discussion around the methods and methodology and data used in the study of extractivisms and alternatives. There's been more different kind of approaches depending on the discipline and so on. So now it's time to take stock and, try to see what's happening. And then in the afternoon, after lunch, we will continue in the next building, the 35 room, in the 3rd floor meeting room, for those who are interested in a more detailed discussion of these issues. So thank you. Please also use the chat if you are online to ask questions and join in. And then please, we have like 10, max 15 minutes for these 4 presentations first, and then the questions. So Anja first, please go ahead.
Good morning for everyone. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, I'm going to speak about ethnographies and how to combine them with archival research related to extractivism. One of my studies analyzes 5 decades-long conflicts between the oil industry, state authorities, and small-scale fisher farmers over salinization and contaminations of lands and waters at the front lines of oil extraction in Tabasco, southeastern Mexico. I draw on long-term archival research, documentary analysis, and several rounds of ethnographic fieldwork between 2011 and 2023. I just came from field a few weeks ago. So I'm trying to understand the struggles over environmental social harms related to oil extraction since the mid-70s up till now. These matters that I'm going to discuss related to methods and methodologies, they are also relevant in my other research, for example, about different overlapping of different extractivisms, like green crapping, agro-extractivism, and tree plantations in Rio San Juan, southeastern Nicaragua. But when carrying out ethnographic-oriented research, it's much better if you can formulate it through a case, because the idea is to analyze wider patterns and systemic changes by taking into account the varied contextualizations and situated knowledges. So instead of so-called conventional ethnography, where the focus is often on so-called local people. I have interviewed representatives of oil industry, federal, state, and municipal level authorities, social movement leaders, human rights advocates, and heterogeneous groups of John Talpa fisher farmers, ejido landholders, and indigenous people. A crucial part of ethnographic methods are participant observation and informal conversations with local people. And they helped me to understand how people whose lives have been for decades affected by oil extraction, how they interpret the harms, and how they experience their living in drastically altered environments. They have also developed diverse tactics to contest the oil extraction and to claim for fair compensations. One of the most influential social movements, called Pacto Ribereño, was developed in the mid-70s in this region. These ethnographic-oriented field data I have complemented by qualitative analysis of oil industrial reports, governmental documents, environmental evaluations, Human Rights Commission reports, photographs, maps, and compensation reports, covering the period from early 70s up till now, which I have gathered from several archives, libraries, state institutes, and NGOs. I also conducted a search of Mexican newspaper reports related to oil extraction and social mobilizations in Tabasco since '75. And this historical tracing enabled examination of continuities and changes in the conflicts of access to resources and resource politics, and the tactics to deal with oil-related harms and questions of responsibility. I want to focus my methodological challenges in two issues. First, temporalities, because I combine ethnographic research with historical research, and then a little bit about scale. During the data gathering, it soon became clear to me that these conflicts and contestations cannot be understood through a single site, mis-on-scorn research, as Gill called them, because the analysis required examination of multi-scalar connections and following the struggles to multiple sites in order to understand the negotiations and contestations involved. When analyzing the different discourses related to the impacts of extraction and who is considered responsible, I paid attention to the ways how institutionalized discourses and politics and selective forms of remembering and forgetting molded the ways different actors interpreted the oil-related harms and their links to power dynamics. There has been many methodological challenges in conducting this research. First, it was very difficult to gain access to privileged spaces like oil industry boardrooms and meetings, and coping with the atmosphere of distrust and pervasive tension. Instead of carrying out conventional ethnography among oil industry personnel, I was able to conduct interview-based ethnography by appointment, as Hanaček calls it, with the staff of the Mexican oil company Pemex, and to attend oil-related meetings, and also to 2 oil industry organized oil conferences targeted for global oil industries. Still, the documentation of salinization and contamination, incorporate and governmental reports, and national and regional newspapers is very sparse and sporadic. Many materials have been destroyed for political reasons, and the responsibilities of regulation and monitoring have shifted between different institutions over time. Many newspapers have been heavily controlled by the government or other influential groups. So there is a wide gulf between the official discourses and unofficial practices, which required attention to who makes which statements and under which conditions. In order to understand the aspects ignored in the dominant version of the oil history, I tried to dig out untold views and contested narratives through ethnographic interviews. Another methodological challenge was, I'm still struggling with this, but now writing a manuscript related to these conflicts. So another challenge is how to analyze archival materials in terms of the time of their production, instead of interpreting the historical narratives categorically through the lens of the present. This requires sensitivity, not just how this phenomenon has changed over time, but also sensitivity how the meanings of the concepts, such as environmental justice, corporate responsibility, or trade unions, have shifted from time when the Tavascan wetlands were a bustling oil frontier to the current epoch of neo-extractivism. So the question is not just that the phenomena has changed, but also the concepts we use and the values and norms we associate with these concepts. So this required attention to the circumstances within which particular discourses and politics were formulated. And at the same time, it required considering how past is lived in the present and how the aspirations for future are integrated to past injustices. Concerning this longitudinal research material, in order to try to make sense of it, I cross-checked the heterogeneous archival material, media data, and interview and participant observation data. I also triangulated information given by local residents, representatives of oil industry, and state authorities. These cross-checkings helped understand the historically persistent and dynamically shifting discourses and politics, through which the views of the oil-related impacts and struggles for justice have been modified over time. Before I end, I will try to give you an example of the value of cross-checking. So, in order to get official recognition of the harms suffered, local people and social movements have organized open protests, occupying several oil installations and shutting down the valves of oil circulation once in a while. There has also been court cases and diverse forms of everyday resistance. They also submitted a formal complaint to the National Human Rights Commission of Mexico. So when I was reading my interviews and informal conversations and trying to cross-check them with the documentary analysis, in the open protests and in my interviews and informal conversations, all of these actors, oil industry, state authorities, and local residents and local leaders, they use very categorical tropes and essentialist representations. While in these official reports, like the report for Human Commission, there is nothing like this. the question in these reports is more like they try to present carefully articulated discourses and hidden forms of maneuvering. I think this is not just the question that people are using rhetorics. It's something more. There is a certain style and performative pattern in in the discourses of these reports, which means that speech is permitted, but only within certain structures. Instead of using very strong and cohesive discourses, what PEMEX does in these reports is that it tries to exercise control through some symbolic persuasion. The question is that you have a capacity to frame the matters in the ways that they are adjust to the relations of power, so that those who speak ensure that they are entitled to do so, and those who listen recognize the speaker's authority or legitimize the speaker's authority. In this context, PEMEX uses the tactics of careful doubting, giving loose responses, and underestimating and silencing the impacts of cues. This is done in order to create a semblance of order that conceals the volatile conditions, which is a crucial part how social domination works. These discursive frames also operate as a closure to prevent thinking otherwise. The governmental reports focus on technical issues with a limited consideration of environmental social impacts. The leaders of local social movements, they also follow an expected script when presenting their claims through official channels, using a set of terms within a narrow vocabulary. And this is totally in contrast what they do in open protests, informal conservations, and everyday forms of resistance, where they all the time drastically pass over and ignore these norms. So when cross-checking the different data, like interview data, participant observation data, archival and documentary data, what I started to think is that, is it so that the discourse of extractivism is so powerful that even those resisting need to express their anxieties and discontents through this language in order to be heard? What I also found in my analysis is that instead of just following this script, those local leaders, they also try to carefully maneuver these discourses, but within the certain frames, not going out of the frame. Thank you very much. I'm pleased of any kind of criticism, comments, and questions.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Professor Markus and EXALT for the opportunity to be here again. It has been a very good experience. I always start saying I will try to be brief, but I never do. But I will, I promise, 10 minutes. This topic on methodological approach for studying extractivism is quite key for us in Brazil, South America, Latin America, because mainly historically our countries' economy growth or development is not a good word, but are based on extractive activities, right? Mining, drilling, agriculture, monocrops, all for export. So it's kind of to understand our countries or to understand what is going on, it is crucial to understand this extractivism perspective or this macro reality of our countries. Okay, that's one. Second, I'm trying as an activist scholar or someone engaged in not just studying but an understanding, but also helping the people to combine 2 or 3, let's say, fields of knowledge, combination of, say, political sociology with political economy and political ecology. Very, very typical from the social scientists, right? So we combine everything, and sometimes we make mistakes, but that's part of knowledge also, right? At least our perspective. But anyway, in this combination of different fields of knowledge, our methodological approach are, let's say, a combination of some quantitative approach or methodology and qualitative. As sociologists, I tend to be more involved in qualitative approach, but I will talk about 2 examples. One that we is just starting a new project on, let's say, qualitative perspective, quantitative perspective and or approach, and a couple of examples of qualitative approach that we or I using a lot in Brazil. So one is we just started. Our kickoff meeting was a couple of weeks ago. It's actually a huge project, 4 years project involving 15 people in 4 different countries, Germany, Chile, Brazil, and Mexico. And our main goal is try to study and try to understand the nexus of different circuits of extraction. Okay, so then using Alvareda's concept in these circuit extractions, a combination of investments, stakeholders, different activities, companies involved, and also different aims, and with our main objective to understand the wealth accumulation and how this capitalist process of investments and wealth accumulation is affected and is affected by space. It's very, well, it's based on Lefebvre's concept that space is not just influence, but also influences the capitalist growth or capitalist system. So, for example, I'm not gonna, don't worry, those who are being in other speech, not gonna talk about Cerrado, but it's one good example. Why the monocrops is growing there is because the space gives room for, it's flat land, and fertilize soil and so on. So that's when we're talking about how space influence investments, capitalist investments, and all the way around. And then what the challenge of this project, with this methodology approach, is two key. One, like I said, is it's a quantitative approach. So we will try to understand the circuit abstraction using like Orbis and other world database to understand the wealthy people or companies. So it's new for me, at least. So I used to work with the people to understand, you know, sociologically, anthropologically, how they struggle. But we try to understand the other side, and for that that would be one. And the second challenge in methodological terms is that we are trying to not to compare, but to establish common points for comparable studies. That means, in case of Brazil, land and urban nexus in this, and Chile, mining and urban nexus, and in Mexico, infrastructure and finance and urbanization nexus. So it's very broad, but in the idea of 3 different countries, 3 different realities, but trying to understand these circuits of extraction. Okay. And the second is my last slide is the like I said in the beginning, I'm more used to work and to study and research based on grassroots movements and local communities. So that it's a methodological approach that we are calling, if roughly translate, dialogue of knowing. And I'm giving you 4 different methodological approach that how we try to do that. One is, of course, to understand and to research and dialogue with the social movements. In my personal studies or research, especially agrarian and rural movements, right? But because I would say for us that are scholar activist or activist scholar, it's kind of privileged to have to research in countries like Brazil, Mexico, or Central America or Argentina, that there is active social movements. So they will bring a lot of issues and research questions, let's say. Okay, so that's one qualitative approach. The second one, it's very important for us. We're talking about circuit abstraction, extractivism, neo-extractivism, but how it's affected local communities or the rural communities or the local ethnic groups. So that one of the approach, a methodological approach, is to try to understand, to dialogue with them, why and how, and they are resisting, like, for example, to the extractive actions or extractive investment in their territories. That would be the second, let's say, methodology approach. The third is there is a lot of grassroots initiatives. So, like, for example, to understand, to study agroforest or practical agroecological initiatives. Why it's important, it's different because we departure for their knowledge or their empirical practice. And the last one, and I promise to stop with that, I try to translate as walking and knowing. One thing that we start to understand is that one thing is to talk to them, ask questions. Another thing is to walk with them in their territories. And it's quite interesting because a lot of their empirical knowledge comes when they start to show us, like, for example, a community that is surrounded by eucalyptus plantation. So they go there and seeing how it's affected us, because here we have this watershed, now it's dry out, or those kind of things. So we're calling a methodological approaches as walking and knowing. So not just, go into with them, walking around their territories, local places, so we understand how they are related with their spaces. That's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you, Sergio and Anja. So I will talk more about when you have done those case studies and you would like to generalize. If you have done studies in several locations, what would be the methodology for doing that? So I present some comments on that, and the method of qualitative comparative analysis. Of course, this is a big topic, so I will just talk briefly, give like some notes on the method to introduce it. So I think in the study of resistance to extractivism, like we have the control for certain kind of things, and this comes like from kind of like thinking of social movement studies, political science, sociology, systematic comparison. So you have to look at, for example, do the sectorial studies and even subsectorial studies, because, for example, what happens in mining is different than what happens in forestry or agriculture, and even what happens, for example, in gold mining differs from iron ore mining or bauxite mining, depending on the mineral. So if you want to analyze more like the political dynamics, what's happening, you have the control for the sector and take it into consideration as one of the issues. And also the style of, for example, mining, the style of extraction. So you have to control, is this open pit mining, underground mining? What is the scale? Is it a big mine, small mine? What is the content of the mineral? So there are a lot of these like data you have to gather to be able to understand what are the parameters affecting these things, so that you don't just talk like very abstractly about all kind of extractivism being the same thing, which is not this case. And what are the minerals? How are they extracted? What are the methods? And then, for example, in industrial forestry, what kind of tree plantations do you have? Do you have eucalyptus, pine? Where is it located? What was there before? Is it industrial, like plantation of 100,000 hectares cut during 3 years or 5 years or 7 years? What is it used for? Is it a cloned version of eucalyptus? Is it GM eucalyptus? What kind of pesticides are used there? Herbicides, fertilizers, all these material things should be included in the analysis. It cannot be just, even though we are in social sciences, most of us, it cannot be just like analysis of abstract social space changes for extractivism or symbolic space changes. But I think the physical characteristics can fundamentally affect the parameters of where the politics is taking place, the boundaries. And then, is it corporate, smallholder state, or other kind of like plantation of trees, for example. So that's one thing. And then to make the comparisons, you have to control for the role of polity, the political system, and other contextual factors. So, if you want to understand, for example, try to generalize what resistance strategies, for example, work, because otherwise you might be just finding out that, you have these kind of conflicts there and that kind of conflicts there, but they might not be because of the resistance actions as such, but more because of that current political system. So there are like broad changes and differences, for example, in social movement literature that has found that, for example, in authoritarian settings such as China, it's quite different to protest there, or Russia, or then in settings like Egypt in comparison to, let's say, Europe or the US, and then consolidating democracies like Brazil and India, and then how is that playing out in federal systems, or then in presidential parliamentary systems. So there are all these issues in political science you should consider. So if you study these kind of issues, I think it's helpful to try to study similar kind of polities or contexts, not too different, because you cannot then really generalize. Or if you do cross comparisons, then you should control for the role of contexts. So if you do these comparisons like I did between Brazil and India, there are two big, large consolidating democracies over between 2005, 2015, when I studied iron ore and eucalyptus conflicts there. Then you have their federal systems, but they are also important divergences. So you can say something general, but you can also say that they are differing somehow. So understand what is the role of contexts. So you can say something about general mechanisms working at their political mechanisms, but also something specific about what is the role of contexts in affecting these things. So to be able to make this kind of precise analysis of resistance, then you should also talk about possible like alternative hypotheses or alternative explanations, like that the resistance strategies don't explain so much in detail the outcomes. Let's say when mines are shut down, discontinued, their expansion is reversed, or so on. Because what is the role of targets, for example? Is it a state-owned company? Is it a foreign company, national capitalists? What kind of government is there? Is it authoritarian? Is it like a democratic government? What parties are in power? Then so on, and what are the state actors doing? So those kind of things should be studied also to look at the contingencies and the role of like other issues like third parties also. That comes from social movement studies, theorization also. So and the study of politics of extraction. So there's a need to understand the broader global setting as well, and global flows and the general commodity market issues and fluctuations to situate this resistance to extractivism. Like, for example, especially important for us is to understand that since 2005, there has been a huge rise in the price of commodities and also price costs. So that those prices are really affecting where you have the expansions and where do you have the conflicts also, but they don't explain themselves the rise of resistance. That's a political process. So you don't have any like automatic thing of like horrible extractivism going there and then local people resisting. No, as we heard yesterday, there can be a lot of struggles about compensation by locals. Like I think most of the conflicts are about getting compensation, and then some of them are actually about discontinuing those things. But I would say that if you have like a certain threshold of a particular political system being kind of like captured by extractivist interests, then those compensatory struggles become more of a norm, like in the case of Peru. But then in other settings, you won't have that so much. So here are the two books that I will be talking about. So on the left-hand side, this is more like based on the multi-sided political ethnography on these issues. And on the right-hand side is a follow-up book on the left-hand one, where I explain more in detail how I did the analysis. And it's also like a methodological guidebook and studies all kind of contingencies and so on. So this is one of the big mines that I studied, iron ore mine of Vale in Eastern Amazon. So I also went to the sites, visited the mines, went there with activists. And it was like Sergio was mentioning this walking and knowing, but it was more like walking and feeling. With me, like asking how do they feel there, and also with the company people and so on, and doing the interviews there in situ, that you are in the forest or in the places of destruction, because that's completely different than being in the office doing the interview. So observing protests, participating, like being there with the people, walking with the people in this, like here in Goa. And so on, like key activists, like really getting in-depth interviews with them, more longer-term interactions, and getting like this in-depth knowledge to be able to have like a in-depth case studies that you can then compare. So here are the cases I studied in Brazil, no, in India, and this was also like a huge exercise of actually mapping where are the iron ore projects in India, because there was no such map available. So I looked at all the available possible maps, and then myself started to do the research, started from Goa and went from there to Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, then to the north, to the east, Chhattisgarh, Orissa, and then mapped the kind of areas where they are more, situated, these iron ore conflict areas. So that's one thing, to be able to bound the cases, and that there's also like a methodological issues here. So what is where does the border of case go? So if there was like one region, let's say like you know, that had different dynamics, then I divide it into another case. So here are the projects in Brazil that I studied in mostly Minas Gerais, a little bit in Maranhão, and then Corumbá, Mato Grosso do Sul. So this is a table kind of that. Then when you have this kind of data, because you have here over 20 cases that I studied systematically, then you have to have a system like how to study those things. Like here I have these letters here refer to different kind of strategies of resistance that I studied, and then these different letters refer to different kind of economic outcomes and political outcomes. And this is like a method, this qualitative comparative analysis that is based on it can be based on like fuzzy logic or Boolean logic. And I use the Boolean logic, which is called like crisp set analysis, where you have zeros or ones. Ones means that the strategy is active, and zero that it is not. So then here, for example, I have a table disaggregating the abbreviations. Well, what are the strategies I'm studying and so on. So such as organizing, politicizing a mass social movement that I study by this symbol A. And I study if it's active in its case or not, or if they use more like NGOs or something else to understand what's the role of that. And here is a more detailed explanation then that I have in the book about how did you observe that it was active, because that has to be also explained. I mean, how can I say that there was an organizing and the politicizing of mass social movement? Also here I explain that there, you know, in which case I studied that the sample mechanism was observed to be case. So what were the indicators? So opening it up the protocols, you know, so that people can see what I have done and why. So, and then this qualitative comparative analysis method developed by Charles Reagan and Benoît Rihoua and those kind of people, you can use it for two primary uses. One is to study so-called necessary causal conditions or causal factor conditions and configurations. So the key idea here is that these are like A, B, C, D. They are like causal conditions or causal factors that then explain the outcome together. They don't compete with each other like in a variable-based regression analysis where you try to eliminate the different variables and they compete with each other. Here they support each other, and there can be different like pathways to the same outcome. So here, for example, I control for the so-called dependent variable here, economic outcome with 1, which meant like the discontinuation of mining. So here the mines were actually discontinued, shut down the projects, like in India, half of the mines were shut down. In Goa, all mining shut down and so on. So I study all those cases where mining was discontinued, extractivism was stopped, and how are the different factors like strategies affecting that possibly. And here, and those are called so kind of necessary causal conditions. So by this kind of comparison, I can see what were the necessary causal conditions. And based on this table, you can see that the necessary causal conditions are C, that they had to protest, and F, that they had to restrain from private negotiations with companies. But it's hard to get that from that table, but there's an EXALT tool that you can download which does it for you. So it's amazing. But and then another thing that you can study are sufficient causal conditions. So here you control for the strategies that were in use. So here I have 5 strategies, A, B, C, D, E, and I control if those 5 were used, what were the outcomes? And then I look at the different outcomes. And then you can say, okay, if these 5 strategies were used, that was sufficient for what? So that's another way this method can be used. And then you have a whole set of like contextual factors and contingencies that, as I explained, other kind of variables or factors that I then studied to challenge my claims on the role of these strategies, to really like push it myself, criticize it internally. And then I had all these other factors that I put in there, like they are explained here. But still, when studying these, I found out that the hypothesis holds, that the resistance, if it's using these strategies A to D, A to F, they can, like the 6 key strategies, they can really affect the extractivism strongly, even though independently of the political role and type of targets, the specificities in the organization, in the third parties, geographic factors, or corporate agency differences. So that was quite a powerful finding. And here is like some summary here, but yeah. And there's just my last slide. So I have also done this for the eucalyptus plantation expansion in Brazil. pulp mill conflicts. So here are all the pulp investments listed on the left-hand side that are in Brazil, the pulp investments, and then in a certain period of time, you have to bound it by a certain period of time, 2004 to 2008, because then the dynamics change when the time changes. So that's also a thing you have to consider. Do another table of these for the subsequent period because the mechanisms change. And then you have the outcomes on the right-hand side if the plantations were reversed, discontinued, or continued, and what explains it. So here you can also see that the 5 strategies were really important, especially protesting. And I used here for protesting also the number of protests. So it's like a multivariate version of this qualitative comparative analysis. But yeah, those are some points. Thank you. And next, Ksenija. Yeah.
Slides. Yeah. So this one. So yeah, good morning, and thank you very much for this opportunity to present my work. I prepared this presentation to show how we use statistical political ecology for studying resistances to extractivism. So my data source is the Global Atlas of Environmental Justice, or the EGATLAS. And so far, there have been reported about 3,900 cases globally. Yes. Really? Thanks so much. Yeah, no problem. So where was I? Yeah, so using statistical political ecology for studying resistances to extractivism. And I use, my data source I have been working with is the Global Atlas of Environmental Justice that so far reports 3,900 cases. And this is so big data that I am using for studying resistances. So this is an online database and interactive map, the EGATLAS, that documents environmental conflicts in more standardized manner. And it's more, my approach is general to what is happening, especially by looking at regional and global levels. So it's very useful for that kind of analysis. The data in the EGATLAS are mainly based on secondary resources, newspapers, articles, NGO reports, local communities, knowledge production, legal proceedings, and also academic case studies. So far, by using the EGATLAS, we have been talking about land defense, successful mobilization strategies against extractivism, and working class communities and toxic pollution in environmental health conflicts. Today, I'm going to focus on violence towards women environmental defenders, that I co-authored with Dr. Dalena Tren. The EXALT also at the project at Autonomous University of Barcelona, we have extended collaborations and networks, or as we called it, ecosystems, with whom we report all those cases, and it can be also like researchers and activists or activist researchers. Here I show only a few of those collaborations, such as Comunes, el Observatorio de Conflictos Mineros de América Latina, and Environmental Rights Action in Nigeria. So, women environmental defenders. This is a global analysis about women facing different forms of violence when they resist extractivism around the world. And it's important to state here that given our statistical approach and the nature of the material, we, the authors, Dalena and I, are aware of the potential of dehumanizing women's environmental defenders' circumstances, and also denial of their agency. However, we also stated that using a large sample is necessary for strengthening arguments that patterns of violence against women found in qualitative and locally focused case studies are not outliers, but rather they are occurring worldwide. So we are seeing in the map all women that were murdered in environmental conflicts in the Philippines, where Dalena also did her research. So here are they and their names. So how we framed this before going into the methodological approach, how we framed this was an ecocide, genocide, gender issue in environmental conflicts when looking at the violence against women, where extractive violence in connection with extractivism, where extractive violence is connected to ecocide, or the notion that environmental destruction is criminal and has devastating genocidal impacts on affected communities dependent on the health of their environments for physical, spiritual, and cultural well-being. Genocidal outcomes are those exterminating and persecuting groups, assimilating survivors, and erasing their culture. Such violence is typically justified by dehumanizing people and denying them agency through systematically excluding them from economic, social, political, and also cultural activities. So this happens through classism, racialization, and also gendering that we are focusing in this research. And before going into the methods, also what is important to state is that assassinations are the most visible forms of direct violence, but all threats, especially to women, direct as assassination and indirect, like slow violence, are difficult to document due to censorship and lack of data, and owing to discursive discrimination against women and how they are represented in all these research and reports that are treating the loss of their life as normal, deserved, and ungrievable. So here is the methodological approach that we used. So as you can see, the data collection from the global atlas, data collection from all the secondary material that were put in the global atlas of environmental justice by the first author, who is Dalena. And she focused in her PhD thesis only on women environmental defenders. And she documented through her PhD 146 cases, so which added to the total, let's say, sample of the EJ Atlas. And then we selected only the cases in the countries where women environmental defenders were murdered. So this is our subsample for the analysis. And we found that there are 538 cases that involve women environmental defenders, and 81 cases relate to their assassinations. So we used log linear regression analysis, which is non-linear analysis at the end. It's used for categorical data because we deal with qualitative data when analyzing and putting the variables in form of 1 and 0, as we saw before, as Markus was explaining in the atlas, no? And through nonlinear regression, we were trying to see the association among non-mutual exclusive categories. So it's nonlinear, and many factors are occurring at the same time when looking at the data. To look at the assassination and other forms of violence as a displacement, repression, criminalization, and violent targeting in the conflicts, to address where and under which extractive circumstances do women environmental defenders experience different forms of violence, and the binominal regression on 2 levels, also 1 and 0, to assess. We were using it to assess probability of dependent variable for outcome occurrence, which includes assassination, displacement, repression, criminalization, and violent targeting, to see the structural patterns of violence towards women environmental defenders, which Markus also mentioned. And in this way, we contribute to genocide, ecocide, and gender or women defenders issues in environmental conflicts. So this was the methodological approach. And here are results that I just wanted to share. Assassinations occurring mostly in the Philippines, Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico, and Honduras. And when we looked, we also seeing the cases. It's also it was not about one case and one murder, but also mass murders were also occurring, for example, in the Philippines. And we looked at what these countries have in common, such as history of colonization, high number of land acquisition conflicts, or development projects. Mexico and Colombia currently undergoing civil and drug wars, higher rate of organized crime. And in Brazil, democratic, so a less rule of law with recent President Bolsonaro anti-human rights policies. And this is the outcome when we crossed the data with ecocide and gender on the first up figure, and the second crossing the genocide gender data in this analysis, as we see also the sectors and what we called impacts. But when we look how these impacts relate to genocide questions, then the picture is a little bit different here. And here is the binominal regression analysis, in which we found the main finding is, if you can see it, yes, marked in yellow, is that women defenders experience high rate of violence regardless of countries' governance, accountability, and gender equality. So often we think, so high rule of law and everything is fine, but being a woman makes the difference and other historically oppressed genders in this analysis that we see here. And we argue that it's not how many women are killed versus other genders, but rather how women are killed is gendered. Just for example, this analysis and discussion also comes from reading all the cases line by line. And here are some examples explaining that women often mobilize on behalf of the family and community. You know, this is what is gendered. Militarization, increased violence and crime, and increased corruption were associated with this. They reinforce the violence towards women, and sexual violence during environmental conflicts is not only physical, but it also reinforces women's inferior position as and loss of agency mobility by marking their bodies as less than human. And we argue that state corporate nexus committed ecocidal, genocidal, gendered violence by exterminating and prosecuting indigenous community leaders, erasing formerly gender roles and relations through also colonization, and assimilating survivors into marginalized, binary, and unequal gendered labor and social divisions. And this article is dedicated in honor of all environmental defenders putting their lives on the line for justice. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So next, Chaffee Wilson will give some comments, and if you have comments, you can already put them into chat or ask after Chaffee.
Thank you all very much. That was really fascinating and varied set of methodologies and reflections. I guess I'll just go through my comments or my notes that I've made, my thoughts on each in turn. With a few questions for each of you, basically. Anja, to begin with. Yeah, I'm interested in how your methodology and your combination of interviews and like elite interviews and archival research, how that helped you to dig out those untold narratives. Because something I found in my own work when I'm doing elite interviews and interviews with you know, politicians and representatives of extractive industries and so on, is it's super difficult to get them to deviate from reproducing those standard discourses that you also find in the policy documents. So do you have any kind of insights or methods for actually being able to draw out those untold narratives within those kinds of contexts and in those kinds of interviews? Given that, as you say, yeah, speech is permitted, but quote from you, speech is permitted, but only in certain structures. So how do you force some space in there and draw out those untold elements? And yeah, you talk about critiquing. I think it was really interesting what you were saying about critiquing the production of a semblance of order in institutionalized discourses, which you say is a key element of social power, right? The production of this semblance of order projected over processes that are actually incredibly chaotic. And something I'm struggling with in my own work, again, is the difficulty of working within the constraints of what is accepted as publishable academic material, like working within the conventions of academic writing, in a way that can avoid being complicit in the reproduction of that semblance of order yourself, right? Because the conventions of academic writing are such that even if you're trying to talk about that trying to problematize the projection of that semblance of order onto chaotic situations that don't make sense, the very conventions of academic writing kind of force you to make sense of that yourself, and so somehow become complicit in that process. So I'm wondering how you kind of struggle with that, because it's something I struggle with. Sergio, fascinating, thank you. I'm interested in the kind of division that you, in your methodology, between a kind of quantitative perspective and a qualitative perspective, the way that you use the quantity, from what you were, if I understood you correctly, you're using more of a quantitative perspective to understand the macro structures of extractive industry, and then more of a qualitative perspective to understand the micro struggles against those industries. And I wonder, again, I'm thinking about the same question really, about how to avoid being complicit in the reproduction of the structures that we're trying to critique. Whether you find that there might be a tendency there to reproduce that kind of division between a power that is macro structural and can be analyzed in quantitative terms on one side, and a resistance that is grassroots and authentic and needs qualitative methods. Do you see a utility in, on one hand, using ethnographic methods to understand, fully understand those macro processes in the way that Anja does, and on the other, perhaps to use more macro quantitative methods in the way that Markus and Ksenija do in understanding those grassroots processes. And I'm also interested in what you were saying about walking and knowing. And I'm wondering if, I mean, it's something else I'm really interested in at the moment in geography and the critical human geography literature at the moment. There's quite there are the debates on and interest in psychogeography, you know, De Boer's The Situationists, and then goes back to the Surrealists, interest in psychogeography, which is a methodology of walking, and there's some interesting work being published in that in geography at the moment, and also yeah, walking as a methodology more generally. There's a paper that was just published, a discussion paper in the Journal of Political Geography about that. So I'm wondering if you have thought about, you know, what it is that walking brings that's different from other forms of other methods. So if you'd say a bit more about what that brings, I'd love to hear about it. Markus, so I was really interested in, you know, how the emphasis you were placing on the importance of making these fine-grained differences between different kinds of mining and different kinds of eucalyptus, varieties of eucalyptus, and different kind of gradations of ore or whatever in various forms of extraction, and why this is crucial to understand these processes. But I wonder if you I can understand why that's important in terms of just having descriptive accuracy and avoiding a kind of blanket sort of extractivism generalization. But what does it have? Does it have political significance beyond that? Does it matter? Does it matter politically, and if so, why? And I was also interested in what you were saying about how the need to control for the role of political context. I'm wondering how you do that. I mean, yeah. Where is the line between political context and the struggle itself? Like, what's left once you've controlled for these differences in extractive methods, and you control for these differences in political regimes? What is it that remains? And you also talked about walking and knowing, and so I've got the same question for you about that. And I was wondering what you felt emerged, because you're saying there's a significant difference in conducting interviews within these sites of devastation to conducting interviews in an office. So I was wondering if you could say a bit more about what, I mean, it's a bit of a counterfactual to anticipate what how it might have been different had you been in an office, but what do you feel that comes out that's different in an interview if you conduct the interview in the setting of the extractive violence? And that also made me think back to you, Anja, and I imagine that the interviews that you have managed to conduct with oil industry operatives and so on would have been happening in offices and not in sites of extractive violence. And I'm wondering how those interviews might be different if it were possible to get those people to conduct them in those places. And Ksenija, thank you. I'm wondering, this Global Atlas of Environmental Justice is obviously a fantastic resource. I wonder about all the unreported struggles that obviously must also be taking place, whether there's any kind of, whether the Atlas has any, or you have any kind of sense of being able to estimate or get any kind of sense of what the scale of those unreported struggles might be and where they might be taking place and where they might be concentrated and what kind of gaps might be in those maps you were showing. The struggles that I was talking about yesterday, for example, they certainly wouldn't have been there. Well, I don't know whether they're on that map or not, but they certainly wouldn't have been known about if I hadn't happened to be there. And there must be thousands and thousands of struggles that just flare up and die away without anyone having to have been in a position to be able to report on them. I'm also wondering about how that map, if you could say a bit more about what counts as a struggle for environmental justice, how you set those parameters, because there's so many struggles in which, as I was again talking about yesterday, and Markus was saying a little bit about it's so messy. For example, I mean, the struggle in Dayuma in Ecuador that I was talking about yesterday, was that a struggle for environmental justice? It was a struggle for improved wages for people that are suffering the consequences of the oil industry but have found a job within the oil industry, but they're framing their struggle as a struggle for wages. Does that count as a struggle for environmental justice? And if it doesn't, should it, I guess? And equally the case of that, the struggle in Villa Cruz, the fight, against the eviction. That was a struggle for the right to land, but it was a struggle for the right to land that took the form of an invasion of a patch of jungle that was held in private hands. The landless people seized that patch of land and destroyed the jungle. So it was an environmental crime in a certain sense, but it was also an affirmation of spatial justice, certainly, but I'm not sure if it would be environmental justice. So just a question about how you draw those lines, and basically. And it was interesting what you said. One of the conclusions you drew was that women defenders experience high rates of violence regardless of government's accountability. And that made me think back to Markus's point that it's necessary to control for political regimes, because this has an outcome or a significance in relation to these. But what you were saying there, that would seem to suggest to me that in that particular case, across political regimes, actually that wasn't a significant variable. So I thought you might both like to reflect on that. That's what I've got. Thank you all so much. It was great.
Wonderful, thanks. And maybe we can all come here in front and then answer these questions, and then we can take from the audience more questions.
So what's the order? Should I start?
Same order, yeah.
Thank you so much, Chappie. You hit the questions that I'm struggling, but your first question was how to combine what the methods of archival research and interviews in order to understand untold narratives. I think it was crucial to combine them because first, in both of them, some of the interviews and some of the archival research, archival documents I have, they follow a certain script all the time. But then in both of them, there are also cases where they go out of that, and they are very informal kind of ways of presenting the matters. In the case of interviews, what I did sometimes, this is just one example, in order to get out of the rhetorics, was that I showed historical photographs for people, both so-called local people, but also for state officials or even for oil industry representatives. And so they started to speak about the photographs. And so they somehow forgot that kind of what you need to say. In the case of archival research, I have been surprised. It takes a lot of time to go for different archives. And it's also very difficult sometimes to get access to them. Many of them are even not indexed or catalogized. So both ethnographic interviews and archival research takes quite a lot of time. But what I found the most important were not necessarily the newspaper reports, but the internal reports made by the oil industry and made by the state governments. Because in those internal reports, they are not using so much control. And what I could find were when they speak about their successes, their doubts, and their challenges. For example, in some of the documents, they speak that, in fact, the harms, the impacts are much bigger than what we have compensated. They even give numbers, and so they were very very interesting to analyze. When interviewing state officials, sometimes informal interviews were quite good, but sometimes quite focused interviews also, which I made at their offices. If we had time, so that the person could explain the matters very carefully. So for example, in some interviews, they quite radically changed my views how the harms are compensated. I had a totally different view. And I think the most difficult was to get out of the script was when I was conducting interviews with so-called consultant kind of NGOs. They are always using the same script. About what you were asking about of not being able to do so many interviews in oil installations, that's a fact, a matter that you somehow have to accept, because there are so many security reasons you cannot go for those places. But in fact, in this round of fieldwork, I was able to not to conduct interviews, but to have informal conversations, because I was allowed to go for some oil wells and oil fields to look how the oil drilling is carried out, which was quite exceptional. But also it's important to remember that those are strictly controlled places, and although they are located in local residents' lands, they are not even allowed to go there. So it's also important to take into account. This semblance of order, I think it's crucial, especially when you are trying to evaluate or understand the evaluations made of harms. Most of them have been funded by oil industry, and there is a strong discourse that no harms for human beings or other life forms were found. Everything is fine and we have followed all the norms. But then suddenly you realize it's a hard work to get the information about contamination and salinization, although it has happened. And especially if you are interested in issues as I am of responsibility. Because what oil industry is all the time saying that yes, you might be concerned of your health or of environmental contamination, but we are not going to compensate just your anxieties. You have to show that there are matters of fact. And that's a strong struggle. So I think it's not just their concerns that there is contamination, but it's difficult to show in metrics or in quantitative kind of data.
Thank you, Jeff. I have to say that intentionally, the division between one quantitative research and the other was artificially built. So I could give some example. It's important because this project, Wealth and Space, we will also mix with like qualitative approach, because we will do field research and interviews and have at least 3 case studies or 3, one Brazilian territory, one Chilean territory, and one Mexican territory that we will try to study research in depth. So that's on my first comment. Second, my experience, not with this, but other studies in Brazil, is that it's very, very hard to do direct observation, ethnographic studies with wealthy, rich stakeholders. Let's use this as my experience with the agribusiness people. And that's also part of the problem or the challenge, to say I'm a scholar activist. So they Google me all the time and say, oh, this guy, no, not going to talk to him. Markus, foreigner, speaking another language, Finnish. Oh, that's right. I think it's not because it's not a joke. It's a way they see us. So then to have ethnographic studies, direct observation is challenging. In most of the time is very, very difficult, because there is political issues related to that, because they know as a critical scholar or researcher, some of the questions they will not want to answer. And also the private the philosophical and conceptual idea of private is also not just in economic terms, but what we are doing is private in the sense that is secret is a bit too strong. But that's one point. Second, our way of researching in the like, let's say, grassroots resistance, to summarize, it's also based on quantitative analysis. Like we have to understand my main issue, agrarian extractivism. So to understand a situation or a struggle or resistance in one of the agriculture frontier, I have to understand and research, like, for example, quantitative data related to soil expansion, public investments, private and public investments, and causes why the agriculture is agriculture frontier expanding in this or that direction, and using that or that extractive activity and so on. So then what I'm trying to say is that this division, methodological division between quantitative and qualitative, it's really artificial, and most of the time when we do research, it blows this frontier or this division between them. And the third one is that I didn't say, but a lot of my research and supervising master and PhD students are supervising people that are coming from those realities. So some of them are researching themselves, or no, it's not individualistic. They're researching their own reality. So a lot of engagement is based on their personal, communitarian, historical experience. And that's very important to understand. So sometimes my job is kind of pulling them off to say, well, you're not, it's not a diary of your experience. How you reflect it in a more, not distance, but in a more academic or scientific perspective. And the last point is that walking is very, very good, important question. I think I supervise, my experience supervising, in particular, one he is a traditional community leader, or it's not indigenous. It's an Afro-Brazilian Maroon community, and this person used this. He was part of the community. He was part of the contest he was investigating and drafting his dissertation. But he developed this idea of walking methodology. So there's a lot of criteria. He didn't interview, and he kind of reshaped the idea of directing observation. That's the thing. But 3 points it's important. I think Markus mentioned, it's kind of in-depth research, meaning getting really involved in the community or in the territory. That's one point. Second, our experience in that was very clear in his research. When the people talk about their experience is one thing. When the people walk in their territory and see things, what I'm trying to say, empirical knowledge is based on materiality. So walking means they pass by, say, oh, then remind, oh, this was this and that. So then this walking idea is going beyond just me as a researcher observing directly, but letting them to remind or to see and say, oh, this was this way and now it's different. So so that's also part of this methodology. So let them to walk with us, or we walk with them, and they will see things that will remind them, oh, this is important for us, because so that was what another aspect on this walking. And the third and last point is it's very hard to catch in methodological terms, but movement, in a sense that things are not it's not a picture that is freeze on time and freeze on space, but it's movement in a sense that knowledge and research is very, very difficult to catch in terms of studying. But the idea is moving in the territory as part of knowing and learning. These are my comments. Thanks again.
Yes, thank you. Wonderful, really fascinating comment. So the political significance of this material or physical changes, yeah, they are based on extractivism type. So I think that's really crucial. Like there are like, I think in general, these physical space changes, they affect the, you know, social and symbolic space. So social capital, economic capital, cultural capital, and their symbolic valuations. So they are political, you know, and there are many examples of this. For example, you have these so-called technological lock-ins, like for example, GM seeds, like from Argentina, they were, you know, brought illegally to Brazil, and then suddenly they just are like legalized, that you cannot go back, and because there's the biological contamination and stuff like that. So you can use these like particular technologies of extractivism politically. They are very political. And then, for example, open pit mines. The mining industry calls what's on top, they call it the overburden. So that's the term for the biosphere for them. So that they remove that, and then, you know, once you have done that, you cannot really go back to agriculture. So the locals, what I found that in places where you had like brownfield investment sites, that means like old fields, old mining sites, the locals were mostly in favor of continuing mining. They were having protests, like the indigenous people living in India, they were having protests of reopening the mines when they're shut down because of the problems, because they didn't have any other options, although initially they would have been against mining. So you can use that really as a tool. Or in Finland, we had this Talvivaara mine, which was like having a method of bioheap leaching to kind of like get the minerals enriched. And then there was a big pollution leak. And they said, we have to keep on enriching the minerals and getting the minerals, because otherwise the pollution will be worse. The leakage will be worse. So you're kind of locking in the options of the politicians, what they can do by the selection of technology, you know. So those are the most powerful tools politically, I think, when you shape the whole physical space, what is even possible. And that's even more visible in like the expansion of these monoculture plantations that completely destroy the web of life, the circuit of life in that place. Like you have an Amazon rainforest there with thousands and thousands of species, then you cut everything out and put just one species. So who can exist there and how, for how long? Who are the possible even like political actors in such spaces where you don't even have trade unions in like the soybean enclaves in Brazil, even those are driven out. So it's very limited, the possibilities for resistance there. So these are also like kind of geographies of resistance. Also like in India, there was like big guerrilla movements, armed movements, and they were wanting to retain the forest cover because that's especially important for them to be able to wage that guerrilla war. And the same with FARC in Colombia, so they are resisting the Amazon deforestation because of that also. So that's also like especially important there. And yeah, and of course, then all the impacts of pollution, deaths, and so on that are caused by particular kind of situations, like creating these sacrifice zones where you create like sometimes even intentional harm to the locals, so that they are debilitated and they cannot have the strength to resist. And there are many others. Those are just some examples of the political usage of territorial changes, of physical space changes. Then the line between political context and agency, yes, of course, I think there's no direct difference between there, and I'm very much against this division of agency and structure. So I'm looking at processes and mechanisms, strategies, these kind of active things that are creating the reality where we are and the political systems. So actually those strategies I studied, like organizing social movements, protesting, campaigning, networking, embedding the state while retaining autonomy. Those were all consolidating the democracies locally. So they were creating more possibilities for direct democracy locally. And they were kind of like part of the process where India and Brazil were becoming more democratic in these struggles, through these struggles. So they are not separated. That said, I would say that I would be hesitant to generalize my findings from these consolidating democracies and how these strategies there worked to other settings, like in China, for example. I would have to study that, and I think I would come up with another set of strategies there that the environmental defenders use, and how that is then creating the system that is in there, and how that might be changing, you know. So that's how you escape this dilemma. So yeah. And then lastly, about this feeling, walking thing in situ, like going there. So I can give an example of like 2 cases involved with this Swedish Stora Enso company in Brazil that I was studying. So one, in 2008, the Via Campesina women, 800 women, in 8th of March, in the Women's Day, they did a big protest in an area that Stora Enso had illegally bought in the south of Brazil, next to the border of Uruguay. So in the name of 2 direct male directors who were used as like Laranja, like illegally, because the company cannot own it as a foreign company. And then the Via Campesina women went there and occupied the eucalyptus plantation and were protesting. And then they ordered the military police to come there. The company representatives were there, and they violently dispersed them and shot there like with rubber bullets and rubber grenades, and imprisoned them, and long prison sentences, a very strong violence against these 800 women. So then I went to that place, same site, and visited, lived with the landless movements, participated in their protests, and not participate, but followed them, and then went to the company headquarters, talked with the big landowners, visited them. And then went with 2 Finnish Stora Enso director who happened to be there, and a manager, local Brazilian manager, to that place of violence. And then I asked for them, so how do you feel about this? Like, here it happened. So how do you feel about that? And you know, like that. And then the Brazilian manager started, there were 2 women, she started a little bit like feeling insecure and like, you know, like that, no, I don't like that it happened. And then the Finnish director took her away, interrupted the situation, not to that, because I was recording also, that she wouldn't, you know, start to reflect on what was going on there, you know, the violence. So that was interesting to see also the internal divisions between the company, within the company, different people there to kind of, I was within the offices also, they observing their work, how they mapped the stuff, and you know, that kind of ethnographically oriented approach. And then another case in Bahia, in eastern Brazil, with the Beracel, half owned by the Stora Enso. There I went, for example, with the local activists to the places where they told they had been driven out, and then we saw the places that had been destroyed by the company. And there was now eucalyptus, like they had destroyed their houses, and then they explained to me in those places how the police came there on behest of the company and threatened that if you return here, we will murder you and stuff like that. And that was also a form of like triangulating the findings, seeking evidence. So they showed me, here were our houses, here were the plantations, stuff like that. So it's not only like you actually go to the field and see what's happened, so that you don't rely on like whatever accounts. So, yeah, so that's some answers.
Right. Thank you for the questions. So yeah, EXALT is a database and about unreported struggles and estimation scales and gaps in the map. I want to say that it's a database, that it's a work in progress. Of course, data can be biased also towards countries or regions where we have more contacts or collaborations. But yeah, still in progress, and it's very difficult to estimate the struggles, and some struggles are historical and no contemporary. Some cases are taking place for more than, you know, resistances 20 years, and it's difficult to say when the conflict actually started, what is the outcome, or success of a conflict, and all this stuff that we discuss widely. So, but yeah, the importance is the struggle. So, and visibilizing those struggles now on the global level. And yeah, with the gaps also in field work, how important and crucial is field work, and also being in contact with people, local people, with activists, NGOs as well, sometimes that are reporting those cases with us, or researchers. No, Markus, you were also reporting cases on the plantations. No, so it's a collective work actually, and work in progress. Also, I work on the Arctic, so this is how we started to document with Markus when the collaboration started 3 years ago. So, and also availability of data when we use only secondary material, which sometimes is not easy. Yeah, and field work is also crucial, like to see not the global scale and the local scale, but also like what's happening on the ground, and with the communities and being there with them, and also seeing like different scales of struggles. Type of struggles, yes, there are many. In the EGATLAS, we have more than in general 60 categories, but we more generalize more in what kind of struggles they are, and if they are important for canceling the project and analysis like that, but it cannot be replaced with the field work. And for example, in that manner, in understanding more in depth of types of resistances, how they change in the place, in the time, what were the historical and how they resistances and how they change. There are also different opportunities, and who has the privilege also to protest. This is what has, what I would say it's important to take into account. And so struggles, it can be framed in different ways. It could be environmental justice. It could be environmental conflict. For example, I work more with the environmental conflict concept, except for one study, which was on Romani communities in Europe and resistances, which was more framed into the environmental justice, but this is also influenced from the literature on environmental justice movement and in the US. And we completely agree that there are many environmental justices that we can understand it, women's struggles, indigenous environmental justice, history of colonization, they are all framed into this world, environmental justices, so in plural. And this is what we also discuss a lot within the group, and also with John. And also working class community, and that Gretel Navas did the analysis, and working in the industries and the effect of working class on their health, for example, and the environmental justice that arise from working class movements. So that's the difference. Okay, and then back to the article that I presented today, and I co-authored with Dalena. So usually when we did the analysis on global level and in the Arctic, because they are different, in the Arctic one, territory influenced by 8 nation states, and so different political, let's say, situation across the Arctic. So we were looking at the rule of law, and there were other also studies that we build upon that use level of democracy across the Arctic. So we saw that in the other studies that usually the violence decreases. But in this article that I presented today, and that we widely discussed with Alena, with the reviewers as well, is that when we put the factor women, because this is what we had data, so the violence doesn't decrease. So that was the finding. Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, great, wonderful. Any questions? Comments from the audience or from Zoom? I think it has been wonderful discussion and really great and in-depth perspectives from many sides. And yeah, thank you, Jaffe, also for the great comments and all the presenters. And okay, please, anyone? Thoughts? Yeah. Maybe if you come here in front, that the people in Zoom can hear.
Anyway, this is more of an activist comment than a scholar comment, I think. Thank you, everyone, for the conversation. It was very interesting and have a lot to learn in terms of this. Just wanted to say that actually it was interesting when you were presenting, there was the Berta Cáceres, who's an activist from Honduras, that actually we were doing like research on FinFund, which is this Finnish tax-funded development bank. And they're doing projects in Kenya right now, has been quite controversial. But that Finnish money was actually involved in the specific project, I think, Awasarka, where Berta Cáceres was actually murdered. And after that, the Finnish fund withdrew. But anyway, just sort of was my comment that our money is involved and we should look into this and stuff like this. But not much of an academic comment, but yeah, just wanted to say that. So thanks for bringing it up.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think like investments and where the money comes from, it's very important in this analysis, of course, as well. And we have like in the EG Atlas, you can put like who is involved, not only companies, but the governmental actors and what is their role in this, conflict. So this is very important to see where the investments come from. So yeah, state corporate nexus. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the presentations. I have also a question kind of related to this discussion on, for example, capital flows and it's macro variable. You have touched upon like the macro political economy of conflicts somehow, but most of the methodologies discussed today, they look at the grassroots, the upsurging movements. But when it comes to the different strategies that exist, not only that come from the bottom up, but also that come from top down, what kind of methodologies can elicit and identify those? We have been talking, for example, Markus was mentioning the case of two board members of this big corporation that were having kind of different views on how to handle the situation of a conflictual case in the case of this woman's upsurge and uprise. So what can we say about the different strategies, also conflicting ones, that can exist from the hand of the perpetrators of extractivism? Because we often focus on the other side, on the side of resistance, but resistance is always to some kind of force that is exerted onto it. And that is somehow also part of the picture and perhaps at times neglected, in the sense that there is also conflict within the extractive power that is acting on that specific place. I don't know if it's a bit of a broad question, of course, and I don't think it can be answered thoroughly, but something to maybe touch on. Thanks.
Thanks.
Yes, maybe those who want can answer that, but it's, thank you. That's a really important question, how to study more in such a detail, also the corporate or the extractivist agency side, if I understood correctly. So yeah, that's also actually important because politically also, because these detailed studies of, for example, resistance and so on can be also misused maybe by, the extractivists, knowing the tactics and strategies used, and they have nowadays hiring anthropologists and others, sociologists, to work for them to develop CSR strategies to, kind of have like counter insurgency tactics and so on. But yeah, there should be similar kind of attention also to the other side, like Sergio was mentioning, but it might be really difficult, for example, for the people in that place to do it. So often actually foreigners can do it more easily, so there's also that issue there, and people who are not so involved in the local struggles and you can do it like that. Also, like interviews with the companies, getting access, talking, like Anja was saying, participating in the meetings, going to the extraction sites with the companies and so on. That kind of ethnography within companies, that's also been done. And then of course, even like more macro level, like global analysis of international meetings and networks and stuff like high echelons of power by different means of these industries. So yeah, that's also very crucial. And then theorizing those, how those affect the issues, and what are the actually like the ultimate or deeper causes there, like systemic causes of these systems causing that. So that's like what I'm currently working on, is a new book on exactly those kind of regionally dominant political economies, extractivist systems that explain why, for example, deforestation is expanding. Then trying to explain more in detail those systems, like ranching in the Amazon or gold mining or Finnish pulp production in Finland and stuff like that. So going deeper into that side to open it up so that we know how those things work more in detail. I think that's crucial as well. Others?
What? I think it's very important question or perspective. And that's what this project that I'm just involved will try to understand a little bit. So it has been, it's not top-down methodology, but trying to understand the strategies, interests, actors or stakeholders in these circuits of extraction. That's one thing, but it's also very important to keep in mind that, like I say, it's not so easy to access information, not only the people involved, but also the companies, because like I said, there's, when we talk about privatization, private investments, we think in terms, material terms, in terms of money investors, but also there is a philosophical perspective. It's private because nobody should know, right? So then, like for example, the Brazilian, one of the things that I'm quite involved for sometimes in this, let's say macro circuit abstraction related to land grabbing. Then we try to get information from the Brazilian central bank and say, no, this is financial secrecy or this bank information. So we don't get information which companies, which foreign persons or groups are buying land in Brazil, for instance. Okay, so that's I'm meaning this idea of private matter. Okay, that's one, but it's important. On the other hand, that's my perspective as a very political scholar. We always researching the social movements, and some of people saying that's kind of accusation. You should understand your enemy. Well, let's put this in these terms. So that's we're trying to do with this project, but that's again, it's not easy since it's enemy. They will not share information with us. That's the second point. But like again, the things I'm researching on land grabbing, it's nobody's talking about like the largest landowner in the United States. You know who is? Bill Gates. I mean, the guy that is rich, the richest person in the world, is investing in land. And from a long tradition of political economy, being critical to capitalism, say, oh, you don't invest in land. You don't, because it's counterproductive, because it's not lucrative, all this discussion. And suddenly the richest person in the world is the largest landowner in the United States. I'm not talking about the lands the foundations buy in Africa and so on. So we should understand that. Just to say that you're right. You should say why. is buying land? What is the purpose? It's just economic, looking for profit or rent? Well, then there's a lot of things behind that. So I think it's very important, but it's not easy because we're talking about this perspectives. And of course, it is challenging in the sense that not just have this macro analysis, capitalism, but how it works, how it's run, how it's daily basis or the strategy or the purpose and so on. So I think it's important, but again, it's challenging. Thanks.
Thanks for raising this question, and I totally agree what has already been said. In my case, it's highly important to remember that Pemex is the 11th biggest oil company in the world. Nowadays, it has many contracted oil service providers. It's working heavily in cooperation with many big transnational oil companies, especially in marine oil extraction. So, for example, the role of shareholders, what is their role in pressuring oil companies for certain kind of directions? Those capital flows, they are extremely complicated, at least for me as a more like anthropologist by training. But what I also consider extremely important to consider, looking at the time frame, what is happening in the oil industry, not just in Mexico, but in worldwide and in the energy sector. There are many continuities, but there are also many ruptures and discontinuities. Even during that period, when I started to study oil extraction in Mexico from in 2011 up till now, and the policies have also changed radically, depending on the governmental changes, but depending on also on what's happening in Europe, what's happening in United States, and so on. So we just cannot stay in one site or one country. We have to look the flows and networks and connections and disconnections.
Okay, wonderful. Anything else? Yeah, one quick question and then we end. Yeah.
Thank you all for your presentations. I was wondering, follow up on Ruben's question about access. I've had the experience that I'm studying green steel and green mining as it is framed. And I was wondering if any of you had experiences in how do people allow access if there's extractivism is kind of portrayed under this label of greenness, so to speak. If you had any experience on that, is it easier? In my experience, that people were very enthusiastic about talking to me because they were so proud about what they're doing, right? So just in case you have had any thoughts on that. And then I was also wondering about, Markus, about kind of the distinctions that you made and the importance of controlling for different contexts and how mining is done and the processes and so on. How does that play in when projects are speculative? Would you say this is still important, or is it then more about kind of how do people envision extraction? What is mining for people, for example, in their minds, so to say, or is it still important what the project will be in the future? Thank you.
Yeah. So for the first one about that kind of issue. So I think these words like development, they work many ways. So you say you are a scholar of development studies, then locals in Brazil often they understand, oh, wonderful development. That's what we do in the agribusiness. So, you know, that's how they start to talk to you. or green steel, you know, so you can use the terms used by the industry. You don't need to, at that moment, start to criticize them or debate them. I mean, for me, at least, the purpose there is to get information and understand their viewpoints, not to do politics there. Of course, later on, you then report what's happening and talking with their concepts, seeing what concepts they use. Of course, at some moments, you can, of course, try to do some other kind of discussion as well towards the end of the interviews or meetings. But yeah. And I think, yeah, and these are like, you know, I've visited there like soybean barons and like biggest one of people in the top 10 deforesters in Amazon and talked with them and visited with them. And you know, in every person, there's also all kind of sides. So, you know, trying to be sympathetic with those situations. And then the second question about if it's still speculative, well, most mining is speculative. For example, it's mostly in London and Toronto stock exchanges. Like, you know, you just over-exaggerate the amount of minerals to capture like resources, and there's so much like, for example, money in this green steel stuff. Like it's so speculative, like financialized world right now, where you just push these announcements of great possibilities to get money for the investment for the companies. And then, you know, it's just imagined, but not real. But then that also matters, like what kind of project you are planning. So then, typically mining, they say like, okay, yeah, like, you know, this is really delicate situation, really delicate environment, but you know, and hard to do that. But we can do it. We can do it there. We have the expertise. But then in the end, it ends up being the same kind of thing. But then that's the marketing they use, and you know, saying that no, it will be underground. But then that said, there are big differences in like what kind of techniques are being used in those facilities, for example. What kind of, you know, if they put more expensive recycling there or not, you know. So those are all the struggles. Most of those struggles, like Shafi mentioned, they are about that compensation or that kind of style of extraction, not so much whether extraction or not. In most settings, it's like that style. So then they also make huge differences, like billions of euros. Anja, do you want to say some last words?
I think you were explaining very well. Yeah, I don't know. I think what Markus just said about that, it's quite common to say that we have the expertise and we are doing it in a sustainable way, and we are using the green technologies and so on. But suddenly we realize how many risks there are involved and how many uncertainties, and so try to get out of the normal way of formulating the matter.
And I would also say that it's kind of getting easier in a way, because we are in this climatic ecological crisis, and people see when a like researcher is coming, they are somehow aware, okay, that might be a critical person, but they are also can get information. Because like right now in the Amazon, for example, the producers, they are experiencing the droughts and problems. So at some point they start themselves to comment on that. Yeah, like, yeah, we have that also, and, you know, that's happening in there. And so, you know, it's turning, because they cannot continue in the same way as before. And it's so you know, the materiality is also there against the extractivists and their continuation. So in terms of access and so on. But thank you very much, everybody.
I still want to say something, which I thought I was thinking of yesterday, and I think it sounds so simple, but we still, at least me, I'm all the time struggling with the issue that Chappie was saying yesterday. This paradigm of seeing always like local counter-territorializations against corporative hegemony. And when starting my presentation, I was almost thinking that instead of arguing that I'm proposing any kind of radical ways of doing research, maybe I'm more promoting like the need of careful consideration of different actors, careful analysis from different points of view, but always considering the very uneven power relations.
Okay, thank you.